In this video, more modifications from DSM Off Road. This is the shock relocation kit for the Redcat Ascent Fusion. Moves the rear shocks forward, remounts them, same with the front, moves them inboard. So a whole kit with instructions and everything in here. If you're new to the channel, welcome. My name is Troy. This is Roadside RC. You'll tend to find me bashing or crawling or drifting or racing, plus doing product review videos and how-tos. Let's get this out of the box and start looking at the instructions, see what we've got ahead of ourselves. So, sticker set from the DSM Off Road Rock Warrior, and then a one-page handy-dandy instructions that shows where these are going to go and where they want you to remodify where the lower shock mounts are. So that's going to be useful. We'll be using that. And then, as expected, 4 different shock towers, front and rear. And some nice aluminum standoffs, screws and nuts, threaded rod. So hopefully everything that we need to put this together. When you're doing this swap, here are the tools that you're going to need. I ended up with a 2mm ball tip hex drive, standard 2mm and a 1.5mm. Used all of those. My handy dandy electric driver, some level of needle nose or some kind of plier to help hold some nuts. Wheel nut tool and some snips in order to move some zip ties around. We're going to start here on the rear, and I'm going to take the shocks loose from the upper mount here because we're going to have to get this brace and this off because obviously we need these shock towers removed so that we can put new ones on. Went ahead and removed the wheel just to make my life a little bit easier too. Now we're going to grab both of these screws right here, noting that they either have a nut on the back side or another rod that you need to watch out for. Here's where we get to see the difference. So this is where the factory shock tower was. It took me a minute to realize all the way up here is where the new shock tower is going to be. That is quite a big difference actually, front to rear. So going to be able to move the whole shock forward, a really good amount actually. So I'm putting this screw right back in right where it came from, right? It was the forward mount screw before, and it screws into a cross beam up here where this is now going to mount. It actually, there's nothing there from the factory, but it's very convenient that they gave us a hole. So I am just reusing the factory hardware with one of the factory nuts, just way up here now in this position. With that on, it's now time to put the top of the shock mounts back in. According to the instructions, he has it 3 holes back, 3 holes down. Now, you know, obviously this is something that you can tune to your own personal preference, but it's a good starting spot for me because I don't know where else. It's also going to still be considerably more laid down than it was from the factory. Now, in all honesty, you could completely leave this just like it is now and walk away and be done with it. But what I really like, what Rob and DSM Off Road really helps you do now, though, is they also give you what you need in order to mount this shock right down over here on this lower suspension linkage. There's a couple of these spacers, so you end up putting a spacer in there on both between the flanges and on the outside. And then you take this screw out and you put a longer screw with a lock nut on the inside. It's going to re-stand that shock up. You know, what I'm a big fan of here is it's also continuing to move this whole shock forward, which gets more weight off that rear axle. We end up with a screw, a spacer, and then all of that is going through this part right here that also includes a little spacer. And the reason why that spacer is there is to keep you from absolutely collapsing those 2 little tags, those little tabs as they stick out when you tighten down the screw with this nut on the back side of it. One thing I want to note here is you want to be very careful with which side you do this for on the shock. You see this one side is a smaller end, the other side is a flared end. You want that screw to come in from that flared end. I actually put this one on wrong and I'm having to redo it. And that's because with that flared end, the end of the shock rod end here can't come off of this screw, if you hit a big bump or something, it can get pushed this direction towards the small end and actually come off, and maybe you'll end up on the trail with a shock that's popped off. The rear of the truck's now all back together and everything works beautifully. You can see now from this angle why we needed those spacers at the bottom there, and that's in order to get that shock out and straight. If you don't have them on, then that shock is going to be angled in and it's going to bind up against the chassis. So that's what we're looking for there. Suspension movement is smooth. We still have lots of articulation. By angling those shocks forward, we should be lowering the truck just slightly and in essence softening the springs. The whole weight of that shock moved from right about here to right about there. Now honestly here the front's a little bit more complicated. Yes, screw here to take the shock off, 1, 2 here, plus another one underneath here if I remember correctly, in order to get all of this off. And in order to get the lower shock mount moved, we have to take the whole corner off. So we're about to get a little more serious here as we dive into the front of the truck. Shocks are loose. We're going to now go ahead and hit these 2 braces here. Again here, trying to give you some idea of how much this is going to move back. Something to the effect like this. And so if you can see right there how much that's going to move our upper shock mount back. And then similarly we're going to move it from up here, the lower shock mount from up here down back to that lower link mount as well. Again, getting it down a lot and back a little bit off that axle. In order to get this last screw, we do need to just remove the motor mount. So that is 2 screws here on either side. As that slides up, you want to make sure to watch your wires, make sure to watch your drive shaft. And now we can hit this screw here on the inside. I'm using a ball tip 2mm for this, that way I don't have to be straight on for it. And there's that shock tower again versus the new one, and you can see that difference that we're going to make. Shock tower mounted back up with just that 1 screw right there, so very convenient. And went ahead and bolted the motor, made sure the drive shaft was in appropriately, and bolted all that back in. Now we can focus our attention, those are there, we can focus our attention on these hubs. And now be very notice, you have to do this part because of how this panhard rod mounts right here. You can't get this back, it binds, it doesn't work. So you have to move the shock if you're going to move the shock back on the front top shock tower here. The first steps here is going to be 1, 2 screws here that are on these hubs, and we're going to slide those axles out because we have to get to the screw for the bottom shock mount. Watch your little spacers, make sure you don't lose them. 1.5mm. There's just a little set screw in there. And by little, I mean really, really long. Shock comes out, and then you can put this right back in there. Similar to the back side, we're going to look for that flange. We're going to stick the screw through it. Now here's where we grab a shorter spacer. They're short and long. You can actually see the difference here. We're going to grab that short one, and that's what's going to go in there. We're going to put that longer spacer again in between the 2 tabs on the mount, and we're going to put a nut on the back side. Now, I think I don't like this. It's kind of hard to see here on video, but the lower link is in this lower spot here, right? And we're putting that tab across the top, that filler, that spacer, we're putting it right across here. And up here in the suspension travel, it doesn't matter, but when you get down here, they hit. They absolutely hit right here. And so that's going to limit the amount of front suspension travel that we have. I think I would rather knock that spacer out. Screw goes through there, and it doesn't hit. You have to get, I can't tell if it's even hitting way down there or not. But it's a whole lot more travel before that hits on the front there. So I'm going to just do that. I'm going to leave it like this without the spacer in there. It just means that when you put the lock nut on the back side like this and you go to tighten it up, you can only tighten it so much You have to be careful because it will be easy to over tighten it and smash those two tabs. These are also supposed to be shorter screws that go in through here, and I believe they're just a little bit too short. It really just barely gets into that nut, and I don't want this to fall off. Falling off on the trail is definitely a boo, and so I'm raiding my parts bin for screws that are just barely longer, and I'm going to use those instead. And now with this in, it is so close to that panhard mount right there. Good news, I think I might just take the Dremel and just clearance it a little. It looks like it clears. It looks like it just absolutely clears by a millimeter, so I shouldn't have to do anything. But I think you do have to run the shock definitely in the rearward more locations. If you try to run it up here in the front at all, it is interfering with that panhard, and you'd have to find a different solution. With that finally mounted up, the one thing that we do have now is all the fancy aluminum standoffs that we had before. They would be now back interfering with this spur gear, and so especially if you're going to put the shock in the rear location, if you have it in one of the more front locations, it looks like it might just clear, just clear. But in these rear locations, it's not going to clear, and so you're going to have to come through here. I'm going to mount it in the rear and most down position. Still put the factory screw in, but then use one of the provided DSM locking nuts to go on the inside of it here. Now we have a working front suspension. Look at that. Now, if you are concerned at all about these shock mounts moving a little bit, then there is still room up here with some of these other screw holes in order to put one of those factory mounts back in. You got plenty of leftover screws here and everything. It'll work just nicely. And also, what I like about it the most is it gives me a place to tie my wire to so that my servo wire doesn't get eaten in my gearing. The back was really simple to bolt on. The front, not nearly as simple at the end of the day. A lot more involved in it, along with a couple complications. But you know, the good news is now that we're done, we still have good articulation all the way around on the truck. We should be just a little bit shorter. We've laid the whole thing down. Should be a little bit closer to the ground. We actually, at this point, with how those shocks are mounted, we don't have a lot of down travel. The truck is really way down there and droop on the front end. You have some up, but yeah, it's sitting pretty dang low on the front now. I think we should probably throw a battery in it and go see how it does. back from the test run, and that was absolutely awesome. Truck was planted the whole time, was able to climb everything with ease, like really did quite a good job. Very happy. Kudos to DSM Off Road. Simple little upgrade here where you modify how the shocks mount. I think it's a good thing overall. Alright, if you're curious about this, they will have links down in the video description directly to where you can buy it. If you're curious about anything else that I've done with the Ascent or Ascent Fusion, be a playlist popping up over here to your right. Hope to see you in one of those videos. Thank you, and goodbye.